Welcome to lesson 3.3 part B. Pre-calc students, here are the answers for 3.3 part A, so you should stop this and check those answers right now. I'm going to roll on to the next slide. You can stop it and check. All right, today we're going to talk about quadratic equations and inequalities. So, first thing they ask us to do is solve each equation by completing the square. So, it's just like before when we were completing the square to put it in vertex form. We are going to want to move that minus 2 over to the other side. We're going to add 2 to both sides. And we're going to get x squared minus 4x equals 2. And now we want to complete the square. So once again, we're going to want to take 1/2 of negative 4 and square that. So that's going to be negative 2 to the second power. So that's going to be 4. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides of this equation. And now recall that the real reason, the reason we complete the square is that so we can factor this into x minus 2, the quantity squared equals 6. Whenever we get it down to something squared, some quantity squared, where it's just the thing being squared by itself, we can take the square root of both sides. So I'll take the square root of both sides and I will get x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 6. So to solve by completing the square, we got one more step. We would get x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 6. Those would be my two solutions. Moving on, we're going to complete the square on this one. This one's going to be a little tougher. We're going to have to factor out an 8. So when we divide both of these terms by 8, when we factor out an 8, we're going to get 8 times the quantity x to the second power plus 1/4 times x, plus we got to fill in the blank here when we complete the square, equals 3. And I'm going to have 3 plus 8 times whatever I fill in the blank with. So we always take half of the b term. So I want to take half of this b term right here. So I want to take 1/2 times 1/4, and I want to square that. That's going to be 1 over 8 to the second power. So that is going to be 1 over 64. So I'm going to put a 1 over 64 in both blanks right there. So I've already taken care of my 8 here. So I'm going to get 3 plus 8 and 1/8, or excuse me, 8 over 64. If I multiply this out, kind of screwed that up, I get 8 over 64. So that's going to be 3 and 1/8 is what I meant to say. And then this over here will factor into x plus, remember it's always this thing that I squared to get 1 over 64, so it's going to be x plus 1/8, the quantity squared, equals 3 and 1/8. So now I got to solve for x. So to solve this for x, I'm going to divide both sides by 8 because I want to get the quantity squared by itself. So I'm going to switch this to 25 over 8. And you can see why in just a second here. I'm going to times, actually I'm going to divide by 8. So yuck. This is actually going to put another 8. It's kind of like times it by 1 over 8. This is going to give me 25 over 64 equals x plus 1/8, the quantity squared. All right, so I'm going to have to add a page here. I'm going to want to take the square root. So we're going to get on the next page, we're going to get x plus 1/8 equals plus or minus the square root of 25 over 64. So one more step here, I would get x equals negative 1 over 8 plus or minus. If I bust this up, the square root of 25 over the square root of 64, recall that the quotient of a divided by b, the square root of a divided by b can be rewritten as the square root of a divided by the square root of b. So we would have negative 1 over 8 plus or minus 5 over 8. Those would be my two solutions. So if you really wanted to work those out, you could get negative 1 plus 5 over 8. Or you could get negative 1 minus 5 over 8. So right here I get 4 over 8. Right here I get negative 6 over 8, 1/2, or negative 3/4 would be my solutions. All right, well, recall from Algebra 2 that there is an easier, well, not always an easier way, but the quadratic formula is a way that we can use to solve a quadratic equations instead of completing the square. This is basically a formula that we developed by completing the square. So the quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Get to write that down in your notes, so hopefully you can memorize it. So the quadratic formula has what we call the discriminant. If I back up, this b squared minus 4ac tells us a lot about what kind of solutions we're going to get. All right? We're going to get two real solutions if b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0. Again, you could write that down. You're going to get one real solution, which is a double root, if we're equal to 0. And if we are less than 0, if the discriminant is less than 0, we're going to get two complex solutions. Okay? And here's a little farther. If b squared minus 4ac is a perfect square, you will have rational solutions. All right? And if it's not a perfect square, you will have irrational solutions. Okay, so if it is, they're rational. If it's not, they're irrational. So I got to put this in standard form. So I'm going to distribute the x. We're going to get 14x to the second plus x. And then I'm going to minus 3 equals 0. So right now I have a equals 14, b equals 1, c equals negative 3. So using the quadratic formula, I'm going to have the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared, 1 squared, minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So a is 14, so I'm going to have 2 times 14 there. So right here, I would get negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 1. This is going to end up being plus 168, I believe. So 1 plus 168. Calculate that on your calculator. If you type that into your calculator, I believe you're going to get 169 over 28. So right here, I would get negative 1 plus or minus 13 over 28. So my two solutions, if I take negative 1 plus 13, I'd get 12 over 28. If I take negative 1 minus 13, I'd get negative 14 over 28. So I'm going to end up with 3 over 7, one of my solutions, and the other one is going to be negative 1 half. So there you have it. There's your solutions. I'll slide the slideshow up. Okay. Now it did tell me to determine my number of solutions. So I should have said right away when I got 169, I didn't read directions very well. The discriminant was 169. So determine the number of solutions. There would be 2 solutions. So I kind of went over that a little bit quick. All right, that discriminant. So the discriminant is a perfect square, so these would be rational solutions as well. All right, I think I got one more for you. Solve this using the quadratic formula, so I got to put it in standard form. First step is to put it in standard form, which means set it equal to 0. So a is 1, b is negative 2, and c is 5. So I'm going to have the opposite of b. I'm going to have the opposite of negative 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times 5. Now, be very, very careful when you do this. When you square any number, it's going to be positive. So a lot of times people will get negative 4 right here. I'll show you in blue. They get negative 4 right here. That's wrong. You want to get 4. Negative 2 to the second power, negative 2 times negative 2 is 4. So I'm going to end up with the opposite of negative 2 is 2, plus or minus. I'm going to end up with 4 minus 20 over here. And a was 1, so I'm going to end up with 2. So I'm going to end up with 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 16 over 2. Hopefully, we remember from earlier in the chapter that the square root of negative 14 is 4i. So I'm going to really end up with 2 plus or minus 4i over 2. I could write this as 1 plus or minus 2i. So my discriminant here was negative. B squared minus 4ac was equal to negative 16. So that means I'm going to have two complex solutions. All right, so I wouldn't be able to graph these, and if I graph this, I would have no x-intercepts. All right, that is lesson 3.3, part B, solving equations by completing the square, quadratic formula, and that's it. Thank you for listening.